Good evening, gentlemen. We have taken a long break since before Pesach. Happy after Pesach. It's the Omer. Happy Omer, everyone. Happy after Pesach. Unfortunately, Pesach interrupted all the classes that I said should really be one class, because that would be the easiest way to do them. So we've split up our one class over a great amount of time. So we are going to be spending most of today doing review, because there is no other way to make this work. Long story short, there's no other way to do this. So today we are going to be spending most of the class, God willing, may I have a watch from someone? We are going to be spending most of the class today, God willing, doing review. So let's return to where we are. Let's get back to where we are. We are in chapter 7. Chapter 7 has multiple parts. There's a bunch of parts to chapter 7 that on the surface don't seem connected, but really there is a theme, there is a progression, there is, as usual, the Alter Rebbe is very organized, and the Alter Rebbe is trying to teach us really one idea, but he's doing it in several different ways. So we began the chapter with a discussion of Malchus, which is God's trait of kingship. That was at the beginning of chapter 7, where we asked the question, really, that isn't the world in some sense necessary? Isn't the universe something that needs to exist? Because we said that God has a certain trait which is only fulfilled by the other, by creating something other than him. So doesn't that mean that eventually there must be something other than Hashem? Doesn't that mean that the universe in some sense has a certain inherent importance because it fulfills this need God has, or allows him to fulfill this trait that he has of ruling over a universe, ruling over something other than himself. You can't really rule over yourself or anything close to you, as we discussed. You can only rule over something external. You can only rule over the other. So in order for God to rule, in order for God to be king, it would seem that the universe is important. The universe fulfills that need. And we explained that really that is not the case. That is not the case. And in fact, God's trait of kingship, his trait of malchus, is in a state of two unities that we call Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tata, the higher level unity and the lower level unity, with all of their details and all of the explanations. But the bottom line is, with these two unities, is that either way you look at it, whether you take a higher perspective or a lower perspective, God's kingship is no different than any of his other traits. It does not, his quote-unquote need for something other than himself is itself part of him and completely one with him, completely united with his very essence, just like all his other traits. In other words, there is no room, even in his trait of Malchus, even his trait, which, so to speak, seems to need something else to exist, it doesn't need anything else to exist. It's totally one with him, it's totally a part of his essence, and it has it itself is like a ray of the sun in the sun. It itself, even the source of the world, even his trait of kingship itself, has no independent importance or no special relevance to Hashem. It is as one with him as all of his other traits. And from this we concluded that this is what it means when it says, Ani havaya lo shanisi, that I, God, have not changed. Because the creation of the world didn't fulfill any of God's needs, so to speak. God had no need for the universe. There was no divine trait that was actualized by the creation of the actual creation of the universe. God, in fact, is as perfect and as actualized and exactly the same now as he was before he created the universe. And then we said that if we understand that, we can also understand what the Rambam says, that Hua Yedeya, V'hua Yadua, V'hua Mada Yachad, which means that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, all in one essence, all as the same thing. Because in fact, his knowledge also has not changed. If the creation of the universe adds nothing to his being, and he is exactly as he was before, and he knew himself, then so too, after the creation of the universe, his knowledge also has not changed. His knowledge of even the finite and changing universe does not actually change his knowledge at all. The changing of the universe doesn't change his knowledge. It's not just him that hasn't changed. even his knowledge, even that trait by which he relates to the universe, is itself unchanged, because the universe amounts essentially to nothing. The universe has added nothing. There is nothing new for him to know. That was our conclusion of that section. And then we came to what we've been speaking about recently, the last few classes, which is the idea of the tzimtzum, the idea of the contraction of the divine light. What is the tzimtzum? The contraction of the divine light. The idea comes from the Arizal. The Arizal talks about the tzimtzum harishon, the original contraction of the light. It's part of his story of creation, of how the universe is created. He says, in the beginning there was God and his light. It arose in God's mind to create, or in his will to create a universe. He moved his light to the side, which is a tzimtzum. Then he emanated a single ray from the original light into the void and empty space that was left over. And that ray is what eventually creates all of the world, spiritual and physical. The universe as we know it is created by this process. So there is the initial step of the creation. The first step of the creation is the tzimtzum, is God moving his light to the side, or moving himself to the side. The Arizal is ambiguous. What is moved to the side? But he moves something to the side so that there can be an empty space in which to create the universe. Now, the question is, the matter of controversy here in the Tanya that the Alter Rebbe talks about, the matter of disagreement, is how to understand this tzimtzum. How to understand this divine act where God puts something on the side to make room to create the universe. So first of all, the Alter Rebbe says that it is a mistake to think that the Arizal is speaking literally. When the Arizal says God puts his light on the side, or he removes something to make space for the universe, it cannot be that what he means, what the Arizal meant, is that God is removing himself from the place of the universe. That is not what the Arizal means. Why would anyone want to say such a thing? As the opponents or the people on the other side of this interpretation of the Arizal argued, they argued that to say that God is still in the universe, that God is here, makes a problem with the respect of God, with kavod Hashem. To say that God forbid, can be found even in a place of filth or even in a lowly place. They conceive of God as like a king in his tower, who looks from his distant tower, from his high place, removed from all of the corruption and the lowliness of our universe, and he looks and he surveys from that tower and is aware of and involved in everything that goes on in our universe. The Alter Rebbe says this cannot be what the Arizal meant. It cannot be, for two reasons. The first reason is what the Alter Rebbe calls, it's mimikrei haguf. To say such a thing is to ascribe to God bodily traits. It is as if you are saying he has something like a body. Why? Because as we explained at great length, there's different types of space. There's physical space, there's spiritual space. But if you read the Arizal as saying that God needs to literally remove himself to make space for something else, and you read that literally, what that means is that God is in some sense defined by space. He's in some sense defined by the same sorts of space that other things take up. And what takes up space? Spiritual or physical bodies. You are essentially saying that God takes up space. Taking up space is a bodily trait. Is primarily associated with body, spiritual and physical. This is a very abstract notion of body, but that's essentially inherent to the definition of a body, is that it takes up some kind of space. Two bodies cannot occupy the same space, whether physical or spiritual. So to say that God cannot occupy the same place as the universe, the same space as the universe, is to put God within that definition of space, whatever that definition of space may be. No matter how refined or how high a definition of space you have, you would still be defining God in terms of that space. And as we spoke at great length, essentially to be defined by space means that space is as real and as eternal as God. If you're saying that God is defined by space, that means space is primordial, space is eternal, and in fact, space in some sense precedes Hashem, because he is defined by it, right? That's the first problem. If you want to read the Arizal as saying that he had to make space for the universe because God was in the way, God being in the way is like saying God has a body. That's the first problem.
That God cannot be in space is limitation.
No, one sec. We'll get to that. 1 second. The second issue with the literal tzimtzum, the second issue with saying that the Arizal meant that God literally removed something, is that this contradicts what we just learned from the Rambam, which is the level, which at the simple level is why we are suddenly talking about the Tzimtzum in this chapter, because based on what we just learned from the Rambam earlier in this chapter, that he and his knowledge are absolutely one, right? His knowledge is as infinite and eternal, as unchanging as him, and he is absolutely one with his knowledge. Based on that, the Tzimtzum also can't be literal. Because the alternate conception of how God relates to the universe as the king in his tower, involved separate from the universe, means fundamentally that God's knowledge and him are not in the same place, right? Otherwise, you haven't accomplished anything, if you think about it, right? The whole point of saying that Tzimtzum is literal is to say that God is not in a lowly place. But everyone agrees that God's knowledge is here. Right? None of the opponents of the Alter Rebbe, great and holy rabbis, would, God forbid, say that God doesn't know what's going on in the world, or God's not involved in what's going on in the world. God forbid. These are great and holy rabbis. Everyone agrees that God knows what happens here. But the Alter Rebbe says, but if you say that God knows what goes on here, that means that he himself must be here, because he and his knowledge are absolutely one. So if everyone agrees his knowledge is here, says Alter Rebbe, everyone must also agree that he is here. By this principle we just learned from the Rambam, this principle that he and his knowledge are absolutely one. We are still doing review. That was for the person in the phone. Therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, the Tzimtzum is non-literal. We are not talking about a removal, we are talking about a concealment. We are not saying that God took something out, he actually removed something. Rather, the thing is still here, but it's concealed. It is no longer experienced or felt in the place that it is.
Isn't that a contraction?
That is exactly what I'm saying. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. The Alter Rebbe says, when we say that Tzimtzum is non-literal, the Arizal says removed. He pushed his light to the side. We mean that when it says removed, we mean he removed the perception of the light. In other words, the light was concealed. The aspect of the light which is a problem that needed to be hidden. That is what we will, as we will discuss shortly. That is what was concealed, but nothing was removed. Nothing is removed. It's concealed, but entirely present. The only thing that was removed, in other words, is a perception, as we will discuss. So first of all, what does it mean that it was concealed but not removed? As we discussed last time, first of all, we should point out, the first thing we pointed out last time when we learned that it's a concealment and not a removal, is that in this, the Alter Rebbe satisfies his two criticisms, right? In other words, the two problems that the Alter Rebbe has with his opponent's position do not apply to his own position. Remember, the two objections were that it's bodily, it's like saying God has a body, and it's also contradictory to the idea that he and his knowledge are one. The Alter Rebbe doesn't have these issues. The Alter Rebbe says that God is here and his knowledge is also here. No contradiction. Everything is still here. Nothing has been removed. That's an easy one. And the other one, in terms of problems with the body, the Alter Rebbe does not say that whatever the tzimtzum is, it's done to make space for the universe. That's not how the Alter Rebbe reads it. The non-literal reading of the tzimtzum says that the universe and everything in it and all the world, spiritual and physical, can be here, and God and whatever is not removed can also be here, and they can both be here at the same time. It's not a space issue. They don't share a space. They don't share a space, either physical or spiritual, so there's no issue with saying that this is like God having a body. We're not saying that God takes up any form of space or is making any room for anything. The entire, all of God's light that was originally here is still here, and everything else, the universe and all the limited creations are also here, and they can both be here. They don't take up the same space. It doesn't make a zelo meshaneh, as we would say, ba'aretz. It doesn't make a difference. The other thing we pointed out last time, which is what we did the second half of the class last time we learned, was about how what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that the tzimtzum is non-literal, is not the same idea as we say, as we learn in Sunday school, that Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. The idea that Hashem is everywhere, that God himself is everywhere, is also not what the Alter Rebbe is saying. Why not? Why not? Well, we looked in the Rebbe's letter, right? First of all, we looked in the Rebbe's letter where the Rebbe describes all the different opinions about the nature of the tzimtzum as found in the Arizal. We still have copies of that here if anyone wants one. So as we read, the Alter Rebbe's position is that the non-literal tzimtzum, the concealment, not a removal, right, because it's non-literal, the concealment does not apply to him, himself, to God himself. It applies instead to his infinite light, to his expression, to what we call Or Ein Sof. When we say that his light was concealed but not removed, we mean only his light, not him himself. Why? Why? Because say?
Why is it just not concealed from us? So it's still out there, but we just can't see it because we used to talk about it.
I'm not sure I understand the question. It is concealed from us.
Yeah, but he's still out there, so everything is out there.
One second.
Maybe we can't see that. We're not able to.
Right, but it's not a problem with our eyes, as we've discussed before. We'll get back to that. That's I understand what you're saying. We'll get back to that. It all comes full circle, I promise. We just need to get there. Why is the non-literal tzimtzum not about God himself? Why is it about his light? Because, as the Alter Rebbe explains elsewhere, God himself, as Ronnie was saying earlier, is not within the definition of concealed or revealed. In fact, God himself, as we said last time, is not even within the definition of existing/non-existing. Right? You can't say about God that he either exists or doesn't exist, because none of our words even apply to him. All of our words work metaphorically by comparing two things. God himself is incomparable in every respect. There are no words which actually capture him. Even to say that he exists is false. Right? There are no words that we can actually ascribe to God. Therefore, also the idea that he is concealed or revealed is also something which doesn't make any sense. To say he is either concealed or revealed, or here or not here, none of these words or these distinctions or these divisions actually apply to God himself. God is above all of these, transcends all of these distinctions. Therefore, first of all, if there were such a thing as a revelation of God himself, that God is revealed everywhere, it couldn't possibly contradict any other principle, anything else being there. In other words, there would be no point in a tzimtzum. There would be no point in him concealing himself, because he doesn't contradict with anything, right? It's impossible that would accomplish anything, because he is not within his existence is non-defined, so it can't contradict anything. So too, that's first of all. Second of all, it doesn't even really make sense in the first place to say reveal him or conceal him. All of these things apply to things which exist, to things which exist within the realm of other things. And then it's a question: can you see it? Can you not see it? God doesn't exist within the realm of anything else. God is totally undefined. God is totally unbound by any of these definitions. So the whole idea that the Tzimtzum conceals him himself doesn't make any sense. He is however he is before the Tzimtzum, that's exactly as concealed / revealed as he would always be. God doesn't change. There's no concealing or revealing. Everything is always exactly the same. And in fact, as we mentioned last time, God is revealed everywhere. God himself is revealed everywhere, but not in a way that can be understood, which leads to the mysterious statement of the Alter Rebbe that the fact that God is everywhere is what causes Shem Shemayim Shogor B'fi Kol, which means the name of heaven is in the mouth of everyone, even children. Whatever that means. That even children have a sense of God without even knowing what God is. Everything has a sense of the existence and the presence of God. But this is the existence and presence as it is totally undefined, not understood, and not bound by any definition, not bound by any limitation. Yes? So when the Alter Rebbe talks about the Tzimtzum being non-literal, that it wasn't removed, but only concealed, he therefore is not talking about God himself. He's talking about God's light, the Ein Sof, God's infinite presence, his infinite expression. And as we ended last class with, God's Ein Sof, the difference between God's light and God is that God's light actually does exist. It is something that exists the way everything else exists. It is defined at least in as much as it exists. And therefore, we are really saying something much more innovative. We are making a much bigger claim by saying that his light is still here. To say that God himself is still here, there's no problem because he contradicts nothing. So what could be the problem with God still being here? God's light, on the other hand, exists. God's light is something that is actually, yes, that exists in all, that exists the way everything else. Pardon me?
It's giving it a physical property.
What is?
Light.
Or spiritual.
Existence? No.
Or spiritual.
No, it's not. To exist is not a physical property. To exist is a spiritual and an even godly quality. To exist. It's just that the way that God exists, I should clarify. We don't say that God doesn't exist, God forbid. I should clarify. Every time I say this, I should clarify, make this clarification. We don't say that God doesn't exist, God forbid. We just mean that the way that God exists is different than the way that everything else exists, and not totally incomparable. Knowing the way everything else exists doesn't tell us anything about the way he himself exists. But existence is not bodily. Existence is not a bodily description. To exist has nothing to do with existing within time and space, which is actually directly relevant to what I want to learn this evening. But to exist is not something which is defined by time and space. You can exist even beyond time and space, even not in those terms, as we will discuss shortly, I hope. So we're really saying something more. We're not just saying that God is concealed. We are saying that his light, which exists, and therefore you would think that something else can't exist in the same place as the light. On the contrary, that light is everywhere. That light is still present. That light fills all of existence. We are now sitting within God's infinite light. God's infinite light is everywhere. The only thing is there was a tzimtzum, there was a contraction, and what is the tzimtzum? That light was concealed. The existence of that light was concealed. To what end? To what end? To the end that things could perceive themselves as existing independently of God. As we also mentioned last class, if there were no tzimtzum, there could still be a universe here. The only difference would be, because God's light doesn't take up space, so the universe and it can exist in the same place. So what difference would there be if there were no tzimtzum, according to the Alter Rebbe, if there were no tzimtzum, if there were no concealment of the light, everything would exist, but everything would exist in a way that what is its existence? Merely a part of God's infinite expression. All you would hear in the chair or the table or anything else that exists is God's infinite expression. That's all you would perceive, that's all that would be here, and that's not what God wanted. God wanted that things should appear to exist as things unto themselves. And therefore, he concealed this infinite light, this infinite truth, even though the chair is still within that infinite light, as is everything else. That is what the Alter Rebbe means by tzimtzum. When God contracts his light, he hides the perception, even though it is true. He hides the perception so that you wouldn't be able to see this truth, so that nothing would be able to perceive this truth in itself, that everything is simply part of the infinite expression of God. So what was removed? Nothing. What was concealed is the existence of this infinite light. It's concealed from all of the creation. And when we say it's concealed, we don't just mean, Darrell, we don't just mean from the human intellect. We don't just mean from the human mind. We mean it is concealed from all finite creations, going all the way back, in fact, even from finite emanations, all the way to the beginning of Seder Ishtalshalus, all the way to the beginning of the order of the worlds, even the highest levels in Seder Ishtalshalus, after the Tzimtzum, such as Ak, Adam Kadmon, which we have spoken about in this class before, the first levels after this Tzimtzum, even those levels, even those godly emanations, even there is not the truth of God's infinite expression is not perceived. That truth is concealed from that place. So not just a human,
That's what I was referring
right? Not just from human beings is it a concealment. It is a concealment built into the very foundations of finite creation, of all that we experience in day-to-day life, and not just the things as they exist physically, but even their highest spiritual roots, even their deepest and highest and most sublime and most godly spiritual roots in the divine emanation. Everything that's after the Tzimtzum is unaware of this infinite presence of God, like there was an awareness before the Tzimtzum. What does this mean? What does this mean? So thankfully, the Alter Rebbe explains it. So let's read a bit for a change. Page 927 at the top, God willing. We are going to read. Let's read. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe. This is what's stated in Tikkunim, in the Sefer Tikkunim, Tikkun Nun Zayin, in the 57th Tikkun. What does it say? Deles asar panui minei, there is no place devoid of God, loy be'ilayin v'loy b'satayin, neither in the upper worlds nor in the lower worlds. God's presence is everywhere. And we should note that the opponents of the Alter Rebbe also were great Kabbalists and were also familiar with what it said in the Tikkunim. So how would they explain this? And other psukim, for example, other sources such as Enod Milvadei, there is nothing other than God, right? There is nothing other than Him. Those who believe in a literal tzimtzum, that God actually removed not just His light but Himself from the world, how do they explain all of these sources? Right? It's not like they just throw up their hands and say there's no interpretation. They interpret these sources non-literally, right? So whereas the Alter Rebbe interprets the Arizal on Tzimtzum non-literally, they interpret these verses which support the non-literal reading of the Arizal, they interpret them non-literally, if you understand what I'm saying. So in other words, when the Tikkunim says there is no place devoid of God, what would, for example, the Vilna Gaon, the Alter Rebbe's opponent on the matter of Tzimtzum, how would he have read this? He would have said, Leis asar poni minei, there is no place free of him. It doesn't mean him literally. It means of his hashgacha, of his providence, of his awareness and his knowledge. There is no place free. But of him himself, the world is free of him. He is outside of the world. There was a tzimtzum, he removed himself from the universe, right? And so too with all such verses. Now I just want to point out that in other words, this is a real rabbinic disagreement, just like in the Gemara, right? In other words, it's not just that they stake out different claims and ignore all the evidence from the other side, as some people do in some modern debates. Rather, they all accept all the evidence and they are able to read all of the evidence according to their side. They look at everything the Torah says on the subject and they see it from their perspective. Just to give you an idea of what it means when the Alter Rebbe disagreed with his opponents about the tzimtzum. But the Alter Rebbe reads this literally. The Alter Rebbe says, Leis asar ponim minei, there is no place devoid of him, loy be'elayin v'loy b'satay, not in the higher worlds and not in the lower worlds. This is literal. God's infinite presence is everywhere. There is no place devoid of him. Uberaya behemna, and in Raya Mehemna, in the Zohar, Parshas Pinchas, on Parshas Pinchas, it says further. These are words that we are going to spend time dissecting. It says in the Zohar, Ihu tafis bekula, I'm in the second half of page 927, Ihu tafis bekula, he grasps all, the leis man de tafis be, but there is no one that grasps him. Ihu sevev kol almen, he surrounds all worlds. The leis man de nafik midashuse lavar, no one goes out of his domain. Everyone is contained within his domain. Ihu mamale kol almen, he fills all the worlds. Ihu makasher umeyached zina lezine, he binds and unites all kinds to their kind. Ila vasata, upper with lower. Veles curva bedalad yosedin, there is no closeness among the four elements, referring to the four spiritual elements of fire, air, water, and earth. The four spiritual elements, as mentioned also in the first chapter of Tanya, of the first part of Tanya. Ella bekedusha brichu, the only way that the four elements are bound together, another way, the only way that all opposites can come together, all spiritual and qualitative opposites can be bound together into unities and exist as stable existences, is through the power of God. Chad iu benayu, when he is within them. Ad kan l'shonei, that is what, unquote, that is what the Zohar says. So let's read it again, just to get a taste for the words once more, and then we will go on to the Alter Rebbe's explanation of these words, which will help us understand his vision of the tzimtzum. Again, ihu tafis bekula, he grasps everything. V'leis man de tafis be, none grasp him. Ihu seviv kol almen, he surrounds all worlds. V'leis man de nafik mereshusei levar, none leave his domain. Ihu mamale kol almen, he fills all worlds. Ihu mekasher umeyached zina lezinei, he connects and unites type with type, kind with kind. Ila v'sata, above and below. V'leis kurva bedal yosedin ela b'kud shebrichu chad iu benayu. And there is no closeness among the four elements except through God when he is among them. That is what the Zohar says. And all of this, as we shall see, this entire quote is deeply connected to the Alter Rebbe's understanding of the tzimtzum. The Alter Rebbe is going to read this Zohar in light of his understanding of the tzimtzum, as follows. We are at the top of page 928. V'ratza loymar, which means to say, what the Zohar means to say by all of this is, I have ratza loymar. You have ritzone loymar? Yeah. I have ratza loymar. Leis man, it's probably a resha tevis in the original, and each one interpreted their own. That's what's most likely. Leis man, top of page 928. Ratza loymar. The Zohar means to say, Leis man de tafis be. None can grasp him, the Zohar said, right? If you recall, this is actually the second thing the Zohar said. The first thing the Zohar said is Iu tafis bekula. He grasps everything, referring to God, obviously. V'leis man de tafis be, but none can grasp him. None can grasp him, says the Alter Rebbe. She'ein mi sheyitpes ba'sagas sichloi. There is no one who can grasp him. There is no one who can understand him. Mikol sichlim ha'elyonim. Even among all of these supernal intelligences, all of the holy minds. This refers not just to angels, which are sometimes called holy minds or minds separate from bodies. This refers to all the levels of emanated mind which come from Hashem. In other words, even his spheres of Chachma, Bina, and Das. And in fact, even what's called the Machshava HaKeduma Da'ak, the original divine thought of the universe, which we spoke about at the end of our previous mimer many ages ago, when we discussed how it's the level where he sees from one end of time to the other end of time all in one glance. Even that early seed, even that early state of creation, which is after the Tzimtzum, even that level that does not understand God. He is not grasped by that level. In his very essence and being. His essence and being is not grasped by that level. As the Tikkunim calls him, Sesima de Kol Sesimin. The Tikkunim calls God, he is hidden from all of the hidden. He is the hidden of the hidden. Which means that even those things which are called hidden, in other words, even those spiritual worlds which are not revealed to us, even these lofty spiritual places, like Adam Kadmon, like the first levels after the Tzimtzum, even to those hidden places, he is hidden. Continues the Alter Rebbe, V'leis machshava tfisa bach klal, no thought can grasp you at all. No thought can grasp him at all, right? To grasp, just in general, just a note on the word grasp. Grasp is obviously a physical metaphor for thought, right? The first place in the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, well, the first, I don't know if chronologically, but the first place someone studying the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus would encounter this terminology is early in the Tanya, I believe chapter 5, he talks about the mind being teifes, the mind grasps, right? Which grasp, you usually think with the hand, right? Well, why grasp intellectually? Because the reason he uses the word grasp intellectually is because it's always emphasized in Chassidus. It is a constant emphasis that in order for the mind to truly understand something, it must surround it, right? To grasp, like I'm grasping the cup, right? This physical metaphor emphasizes that my hand surrounds it, and that's what I mean that I grasp it. Really, the truth is there's also a halachic construct of grasping, which is used in concepts of like kinyanim, of what does it mean to acquire something, right? You can acquire something. One of the ways to acquire something is by grasping it, right? So it's a concept in all areas of Torah, and the grasp generally means, the reason why a grasp denotes ownership is because by literally surrounding it physically, right, I am separating it off from other things, right? I'm indicating this is in my hand, it can't be in your hand at the same time, unless we're holding it together, right? But the point is that my hand literally indicates a physical boundary to the ownership of this thing. Right? So too intellectually, when we understand, it's the exact same idea. When we understand, the mind surrounds and assimilates this information. This information becomes absorbed into and part of the mind. That's why we call it grasping. When someone really understands something so that it becomes part of their worldview and understanding of the world, it becomes part of their mind. It's as if it's their mind. It's as if it's not a separate thought from them, right? This is the unique power of the mind. The unique power of the mind is that the mind is the only faculty the soul has. As opposed to physically grasping, I can physically grasp the cup all day long. At no point does the cup become part of my hand, right? The real grasping, in other words, to really surround and assimilate is only in the mind. Only the mind, when it grasps something, is it so grasped that it becomes one with the thing. And the reason why all of this is important is because, obviously, leis machshava tfisa bach, right? No thought can grasp God. And it's once you understand what grasp means, it becomes very clear. Because to grasp something is to make it part of you. And how can anything get around? How can anything swallow God? How can anything get around God and assimilate him into their being? God forbid. It's preposterous, right? So no thought can grasp God at all. That's why the word grasp is the term. So none of the intelligences, even machshava keduma da'ak, even the highest thing that we call thought, even that doesn't grasp God. And then the Alter Rebbe continues, v'gam b'sachtonim, and on the opposite end, even in the lower worlds, in other words, that's the highest levels don't grasp him, right? Even at the lowest level, afal gav the ihu mamale chol amen, even though he fills all the worlds, going to page 929 now. He is not like the soul of man within a human body. A human soul is grasped by the body to the extent that it is even affected by the body and the pain of the body. The pain in the body affects the soul. The soul feels it when you stub your toe, right? Mahakais from being struck, or krirus, or cold, or chamimus, ha'esh, or the heat of fire. All of these things are things that the soul is affected by these things, even though they are bodily changes, right? In other words, the body and the soul are integrated. The soul is in the body, the soul is invested in the body, and obviously the body affects the soul. It's a two-way street. The soul gives life to the body in turn affects the soul. And this applies not just, by the way, to the animal soul, this applies to the godly soul as well. Because it says, as it says earlier, I believe in Tanya, that because the godly soul is invested in the animal soul, and the animal soul is invested in the body, even the godly soul is ultimately affected by what happens to the body. This is one of the reasons why even tzaddikim who have totally conquered their animal soul and who have totally refined their body, even they have to do tshuva. Even after they pass away, they have some time of purification. There's a purification process because the very fact of being embodied, the very fact of being incarnated, of having a body, affects even the godly soul. Right? In other words, why? Because their relationship is so close, because they're invested one in the other, right? Which is not the case by God. As opposed to God, who is not changed by anything that changes in the world, whether it's summer or winter or day or night. Even darkness does not obscure for you, and the night illuminates like the day. Because he is not grasped within the worlds. Even though he fills the world. What is the Alter Rebbe saying here? There are essentially 2 points. After we read the Tikkunim and the Zohar, the Alter Rebbe essentially said 2 points. He said that above, no thought can grasp you, even the highest thoughts of the highest world. And below, no body can grasp you. Below, no physical thing in which you're invested can actually grasp you. Right? God is not like the soul in the body, where the soul is affected by what happens to the body. God is not affected by what happens within the worlds, within the universe and all the spiritual worlds. Now, what is the Alter Rebbe saying? What is he really saying, right? First of all, he's not saying that we can't understand God. I wish Spencer were here. He's not just saying that we can't understand God. That's a given. That's a given, that no mind can understand God. Like I told you before, if you understand what it means for a mind to grasp something, and you understand what God is, you can understand that a mind can't grasp God. That's not what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. The Alter Rebbe is explaining what the non-literal tzimtzum means, is really what he's talking about here. Because if God is totally separate from the mind, if God is totally separate from the world, then obviously the world can't grasp him. Where does the question come up again? It comes up with these last words we read, which is, Afal gavda mamalelin, even though he fills the worlds, right? In other words, we say both things at the same time. We say, Leis asar panui minei, there is no place devoid of God. In other words, God is in the mind. God is in the universe. It's not like, we're not saying that he's not changed when by changes between day and night. We're not saying that we think that God, who is infinite and eternal, would somehow be changed by day and night. What we mean is that God, who is within day and night, who is within the thing that is changing, who is within the mind that is trying to understand him, because he is everywhere, because his infinite light exists everywhere, even that is nevertheless not grasped by the mind and not changed or affected by the world. It's a much deeper idea. It's an idea not in, it's a deep idea in Achdus, in God's unity, right? We're saying it's not that he's perfect and untouched and unfazed. That we can know without the Tanya. We can know without all 7 and a half chapters of the Alter Rebbe, right? We can know that God is infinite and unchanging and totally unmoved. The Alter Rebbe is saying something much more. The Alter Rebbe is saying that he is within all of these things, and yet they still do not grasp him. That's the tzimtzum loy k'pshutai. The tzimtzum, the non-literal tzimtzum, means the infinite light is within the mind that is trying to understand God. It's not like the machshava keduma da'ak. The original thought of ak is in a place devoid of God's presence. On the contrary, the light doesn't go anywhere. God's presence is not removed. God's presence is there within the very mind. The mind is totally surrounded by and submerged in God's infinite presence, and yet, nevertheless, the mind still cannot grasp God. This is a bigger riddle. That's what the Zohar is saying. It's a much more mysterious thing the Zohar is saying. Not a mind can understand God. If a mind is a mind and God is God, obviously a mind can understand God. That's obvious. But if the mind isn't just a mind, if the mind is also a part of the very God that it's trying to understand, if God's presence is everywhere, the lines start to become blurred. And you may start to think that maybe a mind can understand God, right? Because why not? God is present in the mind, right? That's why the Alter Rebbe comes to say a non-literal tzimtzum. A non-literal tzimtzum. How are we to understand this? How are we to understand this?
I don't know.
A non-rhetorical question. A rhetorical question. I have an answer. The answer is, really it goes back to the idea that God's infinite light is not mimikre aguf, doesn't have a body. Really, it goes back to that. But to understand how it goes back to that, we have to discuss it for a bit. I'm going to go a little over with your permission, since we started late. Speak now or forever hold your peace, if we shouldn't go over. Everything that has a body, everything that is bodily, right, is defined by space. Remember, that was the Alter Rebbe's whole objection to saying that his infinite light is defined by space, or he is defined by space, God forbid, because that means to say that he has a body, right? What does it mean that bodies are defined by space? What does that mean? When light comes into a room, you have a room that has light in it, right? Or alternatively, the other metaphor that Rabbi Yoel gives is a mind that has a thought in it, right? A mind that understands something. If light is in the room is illuminated. If thought is in the mind understands the thought. If a mind is in a brain, the brain is a thinking brain. Now, all of these things may sound like truisms, right? But think a little bit. We say the mind is in the brain, but it's not in the foot, right? We think in our brain, not in our foot. What do we mean we think in our brain? What does that mean? It means that the spiritual light of my mind, which is a soul thing, is contained within the vessel of my brain. Now you could say like this, you could say, maybe my mind is also in my foot, but my foot just doesn't feel it. Right? Maybe you could say that my mind is also in my foot, but my foot doesn't feel it. And the truth is that there is no such thing. It's illogical to say that. Why is it illogical to say that, though? Why is it illogical to say that I also have mind in my foot? It's just that my foot is unaware of it. The answer really, it gets down to the very definition of what it means to be, what it means to exist. For most things that exist, not all things, because existing is not limited to bodies, but to most things that exist, what we normally think of existing, right? To exist is to exist somewhere, for a very broad definition of somewhere, right? Whether physical or spiritual. To exist is to exist somewhere. And that means existing in the term of the where, of the somewhere that you exist. Again, to exist is to exist somewhere. And to exist there is to exist in terms of the place that you exist. So if I have a thought that exists in my mind, what does that mean? What does that mean? It's really two things coming together. Everything existing is at least two things coming together. Most things that exist. For things that have bodies to exist, it's two things coming together. I have the thing which is here, and I have the context in which it is. I have the where that it is, right? So,
but if you take an idea that exists,
yeah,
a few minds can grasp the idea at the same time. It means the same idea.
Yeah, that's a separate thing. That's a separate thing. That's not what I'm saying. That's true, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when we say that the idea is in the brain, and so we feel it in the brain, but the idea could also be in the foot, right? Maybe the foot just doesn't understand it. We're misunderstanding what it means for the idea to be in the brain. The reason we think the idea can also be in the foot is because we misunderstand what it means for the idea to be in the brain. We are thinking that the idea in the brain, the idea exists per se. The idea just is, and so it could just be also in the foot, just as it just is in my brain. It could also just be in my foot. But nothing in our regular experience exists in that way. The way everything exists in our regular experience is that it is perceived and felt where it is. In other words, the mind, the idea being in my brain, the idea being in my mind and not in my foot, is a cooperation between my mind / my brain and the idea. It's a cooperation. It's two things working together. The idea doesn't exist by itself in my mind. There's no such thing, right? What's the demonstration? What's the demonstration? Can you conceive of the idea being in my mind, but my mind not grasping the idea? And the answer is no. If light is in a room, the room is illuminated. If an idea is in my mind grasps the idea. In other words, to put it in a more I think in a simple way, if light is in a room, the room is illuminated because that's what it means for light to be in the room. In other words, you can't have light is in the room, but the room is not illuminated. Right? There's no such thing because then light is not in the room. The whole point when we say light is in the room, we mean it has an effect and interacts with the place that it's in. So too with the idea in my mind. If the idea is in my mind grasps the idea. That's what it means for the idea to be in my mind. Right? There's no such thing as I have the idea in mind but I don't understand it. Right? Which is why it doesn't make sense to say I have the idea in my foot. It's just totally not perceived there. The whole idea of the whole notion, to try to make it less confusing, the whole notion of the idea being somewhere is it is there what does it mean for it to be there in definition of everything around it? Really, this is inherent to space, both physical space and spiritual space. It's part of what we mean when we say that nothing which is within space is self-defined. Everything that's within space is defined in terms of other things, right? To be is to be somewhere. Right? And it is only the interaction of the thing that is here and the context that it's in and the space that it's in that actually makes the thing be here. Nothing is here just as an end unto itself, inherently here. Right? If something were inherently here, that would mean that in fact it doesn't exist within space. There's no such thing as being inherently here within space. If you can be inherently here, you don't need space. That's like saying that my idea that I understand is inherently everywhere. It's inherently in my foot, right? It doesn't need a context in which to exist. It's inherently in a rock. The idea that I have, the idea I'm thinking right now is inherently everywhere in this room. It's in the hot water heater and it's in this cup, right? That's to misunderstand what it means to be. Everything that's limited, every creation, everything in our regular experience exists in a context. It exists together with the space that it exists in. A different way of saying this, a slightly more edel way, a more refined way of saying this, is that if the room is dark, there is no such thing as light being in the room on its own terms, right? In other words, there's no such thing as light goes somewhere and it decides, even if nothing is illuminated, right? I'm just here for me. I'm not here to illuminate the room, right? I'm not here in any context, right? There is no such thing among limited beings. You can't just be somewhere, or to put it a different way, it's the room that decides whether it's illuminated, not the light. Again, it's the room that decides whether it's illuminated. In other words, we judge illumination in terms of the room, not in terms of the light. If we judged illumination in terms of just the light, you could conceive of light being in the room and yet the room not being illuminated. Right? Because then you could have light which doesn't illuminate. Illuminate is a separate thing. Illuminate is the room's business. Let the light can decide, I'm not going to illuminate. If you understand what I'm saying. It's not inherent to the light. In other words, it's a trait of the room. So if it was up to the light, in other words, if it was up to just the thing existing, it could decide that I'm going to be here, but the room's not going to be illuminated. But the truth is that nothing that exists in our regular experience exists in this way. Everything in our experience exists in such a way that it exists, and its context also has a say in the way that it exists. The room is naturally illuminated. The light can't decide not to illuminate the room. If the light is here, the room is illuminated. It's not the light's decision. If you understand what I'm saying, it's a little bit, I understand it's a bit edel, it's a bit refined, abstract, but if you understand what I'm saying,
makes sense. Good.
So the point of all this is that everything with which we are regularly familiar, most existences are toughest, are grasped. This is what it means to be grasped. It means that for it to exist, it exists in terms of the place that it exists. For the idea to, when I say the idea is in my mind, that is an idea-mind collaboration. It's not just the idea happens to be here, it's the idea is here and the mind grasps the idea together. And that's what it means that the idea is in my mind. However, there is a type of existence which does not follow this rule. That type of existence is not God. It is his infinite expression, infinite existences. Existences that are totally undefined by anything other than themselves. Such existences are not defined by the place that they are. They are not defined by their context. In other words,
that's why
the infinite light of Hashem is everywhere the way that the idea is not also in my foot. The idea needs a place to be grasped to be somewhere at all, right? It is defined by terms of the recipient, of the vessel. The vessel defines what it means for an idea to be in a place. God's infinite light, because it is not a body, because it is not embodied, it exists but its existence is not an existence in terms of anything other than itself. It's everywhere, not because it happens to be everywhere. If you imagine a physical object that's everywhere and fills all space, right? There's still a context. First of all, it's impossible, I think, but there's still a context in which that thing exists, right? That thing is still. If you were to see, it's really impossible. It's impossible to imagine because it is impossible. But so forget it. But the God's light is infinite, not because it's grasped everywhere. It's not like the idea is everywhere because the mind is everywhere. There's a context for it, so it's everywhere, right? Like if I could extend my brain down to my foot, I could get the idea to my foot, right? So theoretically, if I could expand my brain everywhere, my mind could also be everywhere. That's not the way God's infinite light is everywhere. God's infinite light is everywhere without a vessel. God's infinite light is everywhere inherently, without a context. It's everywhere because it's truly infinite. What does that mean? What does that mean?
That's a concealment. No? That's the whole point of the
What do you mean?
If there would have been a vessel, we would have seen it.
It's impossible for there can't be a vessel. That's the whole point. The whole point is there is no vessel, right?
So what does it mean, Rod the Tikkun, Rod the Torah, Kelim the Tikkun?
Those are to tell you are not our Ein-Sof, first of all.
That's true.
Second of all, the whole point I'm saying is that it doesn't exist in terms of Kelim. It just exists. The problem is, the reason why this is so hard to grasp is because we are so coarse and our minds are so physical, we tend to think of everything as just existing because it just exists, which is not the case. Really, only God is like that. Only God, his infinite presence, exists just because. Because it is infinite, therefore it is everywhere. Right? It's not defined by its context, it's not defined by its recipient. Everything else within our experience is defined by its context, by the vessel that receives it. The idea is in my mind, but not in my foot. To God's infinite light, there's no distinction between a mind and a foot, because there is no. Its existence in the first place is not based on a meeting of the thing and its context. Its existence is just the thing. Its existence is just the thing which exists. What does this all mean? It means that he has no need. Therefore, there is no need for literal tzimtzum. Therefore, there is no need for a literal tzimtzum. He does not need to remove his infinite light to make room for the world, right? That's like saying, it would be like saying to remove my idea, I need to remove my brain, God forbid, or something like that, right? Or to make the room dark, I need to make sure to keep the light out of it, right? I need to pull a blind. I need to pull a curtain so there's no light in this room, so it's dark. That's a literal tzimtzum. That is treating the light like a physical existence, God's light, like physical light, or an idea with which we're familiar, right? In truth, there's no need for a literal tzimtzum because God's light is everywhere. In what sense is it everywhere? It's everywhere in the sense of it is inherently infinite. It is not defined by its context, right? It's the light goes everywhere. The room does whatever it wants. The light decides where the light is, and the light has decided that it's everywhere. God's infinite light. Therefore, what is the tzimtzum? Says the Alter Rebbe. The tzimtzum is not that he actually literally has to remove the light. He can be everywhere. He can grasp everything. He can be within every mind and not be grasped by that mind. That's the nature of his infinite light. We'll discuss this all much more next week. Hopefully we'll clarify, make it really meyushav, really settle this idea next week. So he doesn't need to remove his light for all these things to exist, for all these vessels, for time and space to exist. It inherently is above all of these distinctions. What is the point of the tzimtzum? The tzimtzum allows these vessels to exist. The tzimtzum allows these vessels to exist, right? In other words, if everywhere we're aware of this truth of God, this truth that is infinite because it is infinite, where would there be room for contexts, for time, for space, for all of these limited contexts that apply to other things, right? So in the bottom line, and we'll talk about this more next week, God willing, in the bottom line, the point of the tzimtzum is not to make room for something else to exist in the same space. It's to make room in perception for any space to exist at all. That's the difference. It's not to make room for something else to exist in a space that they share, that these two things are conflicting in one space. It's to make room for there to be any space at all. Because mitzad his infinite light, from the perspective of his infinite light, there is no such thing as a space. There is no such thing as a context, right? There is no such thing as a room to be illuminated or not illuminated by a ray of light. There's no such thing as a mind to either have an idea or not have an idea. Right? So the literal conception of the tzimtzum thinks of his infinite light like an idea, and the idea has to be removed so that something else can be here. So a different idea can be here, so that a foot can be here, right? A foot and an idea can't be in the same place, etc. Whatever it is, right? The non-literal conception of the tzimtzum says that the idea, it's not an idea, that the infinite light remains everywhere, but now there is a possibility, because it is concealed, for there to be spaces, for there to be a mind, for there to be a place where limited ideas can shine. I understand that the end of the class may be a bit complex and unclear. But God willing, next week we will try again.
That's why the four elements can